with us. My name's Kate Fogarty. I'm the principal at Assumption College, and it's my privilege to be the MC this evening for our Helder Kamara lecture. In fact, the second Helder Kamara lecture for this year. Would you join me in welcoming Dr. Guglielmo Gallotti, who's going to welcome us again to beautiful Newman College, back into the room together, and also to pay our respects. Oh no. Could you all hear me here? Yes. Fantastic. See, that's a good principal's voice, isn't it? So I'd like to welcome Dr. Guglielmo to welcome us to Newman College and also to acknowledge the wonderful, beautiful land that we're on. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kate, and apologies for these technical issues. Good evening, Reverend Sisters, Reverend Fathers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Guglielmo Gallotti. I'm the Provost of Newman College, and I would like to warmly welcome you all to the College Oratory, and as Kate said, for this year's second Helder Kamara lecture. The first one, some of you would have been in the room, was held on the 31st of February this year, when the college hosted Sister Nathalie Becard, a member of the Xaverian Sisters, missionaries of Jesus Christ in France, who Pope Francis appointed as only one of 4 women as consultor to the General Secretariat of the Synod of Bishops, but also since 2021, I believe, held positions as Under-Secretary of the Synod of Bishops and member of the Dicastery of Communication, or for Communication. On that event, she spoke about the spirituality of synodality, giving the then audience an opportunity to reflect on the different ways as Catholics, we as Catholics could perhaps consider or reconsider spirituality in the context of the synodal process. And this evening, to continue the conversation on synodality, and for our second Helder Kamara lecture this year, I have the pleasure to welcome, fresh from the Universal Synod on Synodality held in Rome last October, journalist, Pope Francis expert, Vatican insider, Mr. Christopher White, from the National Catholic Reporter, who this evening will deliver the public lecture entitled, Will Our Faith Have Children? Reflections on the Health and Dynamism of Global Catholicism. So Christopher, you are most welcome at Newman College. It is indeed an honor to have you here as our guest, and a privilege to hear you speak and to relay your experience of the synod process on the future of our church and of Pope Francis's pontificate via your address. I take this opportunity to thank and to welcome back to college Kate Fogarty, the principal of Assumption College, who has kindly agreed to facilitate the lecture today alongside with our rector, the rector of Newman College, Father Frank Brennan. And finally, I would like to express my gratitude on behalf of the college to the Pace Foundation and the Myers family for their continued support of the Helder Kamara lecture series. I believe next year will be the 39th year that we're holding the Helder Kamara lecture series, and in 2025 it will be the 40th anniversary. That is quite the anniversary to be proud of. And so in my thanks, I must not forget the tireless efforts of Brother Mark O'Connor, Newman's own Pope Francis Fellow, in coordinating all these important events for us. And now, please allow me to start with the formal proceedings with the Newman Acknowledgement of Country. So we at Newman College acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, who have walked upon and cared for this land for thousands of years. We acknowledge the continued deep spiritual attachment and relationship of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to this country, and we commit ourselves to the ongoing journey of reconciliation. We respect the Wurundjeri elders past and present, and we extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present. So So just prior to handing over to Kate, a few logistical matters for those of you who are new to this space and to this lecture series. Could I please invite everyone to kindly switch off their mobile phones or place them on silent. The toilets are located at the rear of the oratory on this level and at one level directly below. And as we've seen, a reminder that this lecture is being live streamed and recorded, and that a web link will be available on the Newman College website as soon as possible. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Kate Fogarty to formally introduce Christopher White. Thank you.
Thanks, Guillermo. I think I say on behalf of all of us, it's just terrific to be back here at Newman College again. Just an idea of how this evening's going to proceed. We're going to begin with Chris giving us about a 35-minute presentation on his experiences and his response to the question that's been asked today. And the reason why we've been a little held up is because he's going to share some fabulous photos with us, and we need to see them to be able to understand the full experience. Father Frank is then going to respond and ask some questions of his own, and then I'll throw the floor open to those of you who would like to ask some further questions of Chris. So given that we've had a bio of Chris and knowing a little bit about him as we do, Chris, I'm going to invite you up because I think we're all just very keen to hear, will our faith have children? Come and tell us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate. Thank you all for welcoming me here. I think tonight is going to be, it's already been a bit of an adventure, and it will be for me as well, because I brought along some photos that I hope to show you and kind of help shape our discussion as postcards from the Synod, and we may or may not have those, so if you'll just bear with me as we experiment a bit together. But as Kate mentioned, I've just finished covering the Synod of Bishops in Rome. And it's a real treat for me to come to Australia directly from that, because I think it's fair to say that there's no country in the world that had such an effect on the proceedings of the Synod than Australia. You should be proud to know that you had the third largest delegation of any country in the world. And the Vatican Synod Office drew deeply from the experience of the plenary council here in shaping the Synod. So I think you all owe yourselves a round of applause for your own efforts here in Australia. The Global Church has learned and continues to learn a lot from all of you. I also want to thank Brother Mark, who has already been mentioned. I spent last week in Sydney with Brother Mark, and as a native of Melbourne, every time that we encountered someone else from Melbourne, he said, "They're from Melbourne, you can trust them." They're not like these Sydney people, so. I'd also like to thank Father Frank, who is, as a journalist, I've long read Father Frank's work, and so to be on your own turf is a real honor as well, so thank you for having me. I want to ensure that we have plenty of time for discussion, so I'm going to try to just walk you through the Synod and answer this question, will our faith have children, by sharing some scenes or some moments from the Synod that I hope begin to answer that question and kind of give you a sense of what was happening last month in Rome at the global level during the Synod. Jesus taught in parables to sort of illuminate a larger message, so I hope these sort of stories from the Synod can do that about what exactly was happening over there in Rome and what this means. I've often said, oh, look, we're in business, this is great. I've often said that not only are images useful for telling the story of the Synod, but in fact, they're one of the few ways we can tell the story of the Synod from last month. Because on day one of the Synod, Pope Francis effectively established a sort of media blackout. He asked those in the room to fast from public words during the month of the Synod. And so those of us covering the Synod, and this was the third Synod that I've covered, we're in a bit of a quandary of how we were going to go about this, covering this for a month. But the images that emerged over the course of the month began to tell a story on their own. And of course, those of us who are paid to cover the Vatican, it was our job to also talk to those in the room day in and day out to begin to piece a story together of what was happening inside the room. But the images are quite powerful, and I'm happy to be able to share some of these images and stories with you. I've been invited here this evening to speak on the question of will our faith have children? And it's a loaded question, it's an existential question, and I have to begin with a disclaimer that as a journalist, it's a question that I don't want to answer. I think, for one, journalists are inclined to look for conflict, and so conflict is helpful. And so answering a question like, will our faith have children, begins to sort of provide a resolution. And then the other problem I kind of have is, will our faith have children? Answering that question requires to sort of put myself in the story and give you my own personal opinions. And as a journalist, I try most of the time to keep myself out of the story. It's a bit of an occupational hazard when you start making the story about yourself. So bear with me as I try to muddle through this together. But I want to begin by taking you to this scene. This is the doors of the Vatican Synod office on the Via della Conciliazione. It's that very famous and iconic road that leads to St. Peter's Square. And if we were to go back to 2019, this photo was taken on the eve of the Synod on the Amazon, where Pope Francis had called a special synod to focus on the unique pastoral needs of those 9 nations that make up the Amazon region. There were 185 delegates to that synod that would have a vote, including a religious brother, like Brother Mark, for example. Meaning that someone who was not ordained as a priest or a bishop would have the right to vote. And although a handful of women had been invited to attend that synod, particularly to represent religious congregations, they were not given that same right to vote. For some people, this was a frustrating situation. Women have the same status in the church as non-ordained men, but a non-ordained man had been given the right to vote. Just days before that synod in 2019 began, a group of several dozen women gathered in front of the Vatican Synod office that you see here. They prayed, they held signs, they even lit the door up with this special lighting that simply said, "Votes for Catholic Women." Among those women was one from Switzerland named Helena Jeppesen. She's a lay pastoral worker, and she's worked in the church for decades in a number of relief agencies. She left Rome frustrated by the fact that she had been there surrounded by religious sisters and other women, and she was protesting what she viewed the injustice of the situation. But she also left determined, and when Pope Francis announced that the next synod would be a years-long multi-faith process that took place first through local listening sessions, then at the diocesan level, then at the national level, then at the continental level, and then in Rome, Helena poured herself into the process. She was confident that the church could and should change. And this month, when the Synod of Bishops began in Rome, Jeppesen was no longer standing outside of the doors of the Synod office. She was inside the room as one of 54 women who had been, for the first time ever, been given the right to vote. And here's a photo of the roughly 54 women who were there at the Synod. They gathered together one afternoon at the UISG, the umbrella group that represents women religious congregations. And this is them there gathered just as women to talk about their experience at the Synod. During the final week of the Synod, I caught up with Helena, and I asked her what this was like, and I want to read to you some of her words. Quote, "What I see as a symbol for the future is when we were here in 2019 for the Amazon Synod, there was a group of Swiss sisters and sisters from throughout Europe standing in front of the Synod office, and we had a small symposium on the right for the religious to vote in the Synod, because it was not possible yet. And only 4 years after that, the doors of the Synod office were opened for everybody. We were able to go there to discuss our own issues. This is a symbol for me," she said. "Let's open more doors for women in the Catholic Church." Helena's appointment wasn't the only one. In 2018, Sister Natalie Beccar France, who's just mentioned, was one of the delegates at the Synod on young people. Many of you perhaps were here when she spoke in this very space just earlier this year. In just a few short years, she went from being a non-voting delegate at the Synod to the number 2 official at the Vatican Synod office, having a voice and vote in not just one synod, but in the highest ranks of the Vatican every day throughout the year. Indeed, you can see her here sitting at the Pope's table during the synod sessions. To begin to answer the question, will our faith have children, I'd like to suggest that the very presence of these new synod mothers, as they were called, is a positive development in giving birth to a very new and different type of church. But to better understand this new type of church and understand the sometimes jargony talk of synodality, which literally means walking together. It's a term that my editors hate because you put it in print, and unless you're an insider, you have no clue what this is all about. I think we have to go back further. For some of you, many of you, this is probably a history that you're already familiar with, so forgive me. But just to make sure we're on the same page, let's go back to 1965 when Pope Paul VI established the synod process at the end of the Second Vatican Council. It was an effort to extend collegiality among bishops and invite greater conversation about topics of importance in the life of the Church. Since that time, synods have been called and have been meeting for every few years, but for a number of reasons, the Synod of Bishops were never really known to be contributing to the life of the Church in a particular felt way. There's an old joke that's often told in Rome that during synods that were taking place under Pope John Paul II, the Pope could be seen at the front of the room reading his breviary as the bishops were engaged in discussions. John Paul, they said, was actually reading the final document for the synod. In other words, there was a foregone conclusion that had already been established before the synod began. And I think it's fair to say for a number of reasons, both Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI were in many ways afraid of starting conversations that they couldn't contain or that they didn't know how they would conclude. While the synod process is a fruit of the Second Vatican Council, to understand what's happening now, I think we should also remember what happened in 2007, when bishops from around Latin America also met in Aparecida, Brazil. During those 2 weeks in May of 2007, they left an indelible mark on then Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the Archbishop of Buenos Aires. I think those 2 weeks dramatically affected the direction in which he's trying to take the global church today. When these South American bishops gathered in Aparecida, it came as a capstone or a conclusion of a 2-year listening process from all over the global South, where church leaders were taking stock of the world around them, or to use the language of the Second Vatican Council, they were reading the signs of the time. There was tremendous income inequality. Catholics were hemorrhaging numbers from the rise of Pentecostalism, and there was a general consensus that the church had not only lost its way, but had left the church and its people, the people of God, behind. Critically, the question they were asking themselves was, quote, how do we transmit the faith from one generation to the next? If you talk to those that participated in Aparecida, they said it was a time of great humility and also confusion because they simply didn't know what to do. But in listening to each other, and importantly, listening to their people, they experienced what some of them described as, quote, a Latin American Pentecost. This, in many ways, I would suggest, is the beginning of Pope Francis's understanding of synodality and perhaps his entire pontificate. Jorge Mario Bergoglio served as the lead writer of that final document of Aparecida, and his elevator pitch or summary of the conclusion of that meeting was, quote, that the church in Latin America should be helping each Christian have a personal encounter with Christ, living with simplicity and humility taught in the gospel, a preferential option for the poor and marginalized, a serious concern for the environment, and prayer. I think if you listen to that description, you'll also get a pretty good summation of what the last 10 years of the Francis papacy has been about. Francis was deeply moved by and affected by what he saw in Latin America and how the church there began to transform itself after Aparecida. And immediately after becoming Pope, he began to use a similar process of listening and discernment to shape the global church. First, he called the Synods on the Family in 2014 and 15, followed by the Synod on Young People in 2018, followed by the Special Synod on the Amazon region in 2019, and then finally tackling it head-on with this multi-phase, multi-year process of this Synod on Synodality that just concluded in Rome and we'll meet again next October. The most important thing in all of this that Pope Francis and Cardinal Mario Grech, who heads the Vatican Synod Office, has emphasized is that the Synod is no longer just an event. It's about an approach or a process and a new way of being church. As Cardinal Arthur Roach, the head of the Vatican's worship office, put it to me in an interview earlier this year, quote, "It is a call for the church to be an instrument of metanoia, not of paranoia." Quote, "Metanoia opens us up. It goes toward God. It goes toward others. Paranoia is obsessive and closes down, and we're locked within ourselves." On the afternoon of October 12th last month, just over a week into the Synod, the more than 450 delegates participating in the Synod made their way from the Vatican to the outskirts of Rome to the catacombs of San Sebastian and San Callistus near Rome's Appian Way. It was a sort of an informal field trip meant to take Synod participants back to the roots of the Christian faith. There in those catacombs, the relics of both St. Peter and St. Paul had been taken during a particular time when there was severe vandalism and persecution taking place in Rome. Those Synod delegates were shown miles and miles of underground burial sites for Christians of the early church. It was an egalitarian system where Christians of all social and economic backgrounds were buried together. They were also given a prayer booklet. And at the very back of that was a text known as the Pact of the Catacombs, a largely unknown text to many of them. In November of 1965, some 40 bishops that had been participating in the Second Vatican Council gathered at night at the nearby catacombs of Domitilla. As the Mass concluded, those bishops went up to the altar one by one, and they signed a pact committing to take many of the aims of the Council and live it in their own lives and ministries. In particular, they wanted to be a church for the poor. Among those there that night was Dom Helder Camara, whose memory we invoke this evening. He and 41 other bishops committed to, quote, to be faithful to the Spirit of Jesus in the service of the poor, to renounce privileges, personal assets, and pompousness, and to promote justice, charity, collegiality, and communion with the people of God. Now, regrettably, that pact was largely forgotten, at least by church leaders in the West. But in the global South, it was kept alive by church leaders like Camara and indeed Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who both in Aparecida and then upon his election as Pope in 2013 dreamed of, quote, a poor church for the poor. Will our faith have children, we ask? The visit of the Synod delegates to the catacombs, indeed the very birthplace of the early church, served as a reminder that if the church is to be reborn, it must recover those early aims and priorities of a church that is, in the words of the Catacombs Pact, quote, more humanly present, more welcoming, and open to all. Round tables are the icon of this synod. Those were the words of Cardinal Michael Czerny, a close advisor of Pope Francis, just a few days after the synod ended. Now, for those of you here in this room that participated or followed the plenary council, this image at the bottom right won't look that unfamiliar. I don't want to overemphasize one piece of furniture and overhype what it did, but the fact that round tables were used for this synod does, to a certain extent, mark a revolution for the Catholic Church. Historically, synods have taken place in the Vatican Synod Hall, which you can see up here on the other side, which you might be able to make out uses stadium-style seating. There you have the Pope at the front of the room, facing first the cardinals in the first few rows, then the bishops, then if there is anyone invited, priests or lay people at the very top, furthest away from the action. This new arrangement allowed, or perhaps forced, participants to encounter each other face to face rather than feeling like they were in a lecture hall for an entire month. More importantly, the round tables were filled with women and men from all around the globe, sitting shoulder to shoulder with cardinals and bishops with the same level of participation. Now, that sounds great, but there were some challenges. At a certain point, a priest was watching a bishop who had been elected as the Roundtable secretary, take notes that he was then tasked with later reporting back to the full assembly. The bishop saw him watching him take these notes, and he was rather irritated, and he snapped at the priest that if he didn't stop monitoring him, he'd throw him out of the room. As one delegate who watched the scene unfold said to me, quote, "The bishop didn't understand that in this environment, he didn't have the authority to do that." Perhaps most importantly, the synod utilized a new method known as conversations in the spirit. While in past synods, delegates gave prepared remarks for hours and days on end, in this new method, each member of the round table was allowed to speak, but then also asked to pause for several minutes of silence and prayer between each individual intervention. The idea was to facilitate greater listening. In this method, no one participating could become a star of the synod or a grandstand, but instead, each delegate was given the exact same amount of time to speak. This had some challenges. One delegate described it to me as, quote, "the tyranny of the articulate," where those more accustomed to speaking in public forums could either inadvertently or perhaps intentionally intimidate participants with less experience or comfort in speaking in such an environment. But it did level the playing field so that priests, bishops, and laity alike were invested in a joint co-responsibility for the process. No one was more important than anyone else. To quote from Archbishop Mark Coleridge of Brisbane, synodality under Pope Francis has shifted from, quote, "some of the bishops, some of the time," to all of the bishops, and in fact, all of the church, all of the time. Now, while Pope Francis's synod process, which some people have described as the largest consultation exercise in human history, has invited Catholics and, in fact, non-Catholics from all over the world to share their hopes, their dreams, their anxieties and fears, it's been subject to no shortage of criticism. Some of those critics have been members from the Pope's own team. Before the Synod session in Rome, German Cardinal Gerhard Müller, who used to be the head of the Pope's doctrinal office, characterized the Synod as, quote, "a hostile takeover of the Church." Even though Cardinal Müller is retired, the Pope's response to such criticism was to invite him in the room and to be a part of the conversation. In fact, the Pope, as part of his handpicked invites to the Synod, included several prominent church leaders who had been dubious about this whole idea of synodality. I think if one surveys the state of other Christian churches today, there's no shortage of divisions. Just last year, the United Methodist Church in my home country lost 1/5 of its membership over disagreements regarding human sexuality. We've seen robust discussions in Presbyterians, Lutherans, Episcopalians, and other Christian churches over the last 2 decades. Those same disagreements are very real in our Catholic Church. It's quite difficult for delegates from Denmark and Canada to fully understand why church leaders in Africa are focused on pastoral solutions for polygamous marriages. But it's very puzzling for those same church leaders in Africa to understand all the energy surrounding the question of women deacons or blessings for same-sex couples. Through synodality, the Pope is trying to find a space to contain these disagreements so that by the bond of communion, these divergences will not be papered over, but contained in a church that makes room for everyone. Or as the Pope said, now infamously at World Youth Day in Lisbon this past August, todos, 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 or tutti, 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 everyone, everyone, everyone. British theologian Anna Rowlands, when she addressed the Synod delegates, put it like this: "Communion is the very power of this room. The scandalous friendship of Jesus that drew a community of disciples together were so often table friendships, and table friendships matter." Here's a photo that shocked a number of Catholics in that live online. It's a photo of Jesuit Father James Martin from my home country, and he's known especially for his outreach to LGBTQ Catholics, and he's posing with Cardinal Müller, who I just mentioned earlier. Not only has the German cardinal been a real critic of synodality, but he's been especially dismissive of the Pope's pastoral outreach to LGBTQ Catholics and any efforts along those lines. But here's this tweet. You can see what Father Martin wrote. He says, "Honored to meet Cardinal Gerhard Müller at the Synod. I've long admired his friendship with Gustavo Gutierrez, the father of liberation theology. His Eminence graciously gave me his book with Gutierrez, and I gave him a copy of my book on Jesus. That wasn't supposed to get a laugh, but now that photo happened in the early days of the Synod, and Father Martin told me that this initial encounter provided a space for the two of them to continue the conversation almost daily in the Synod Hall throughout the rest of the month. Last week, or 2 weeks ago, the day after the Synod ended, I had lunch with Ghanaian theologian Nora Nantera, who is one of two African laywomen in the Synod. You can see her here. I'd met Nora a few years ago in Nigeria, and she really impressed me because she had no problem speaking to bishops very bluntly and very frankly. And she also spoke at the Synod press conference during one of the final days, and she impressed my colleagues when she described her experience. And I want to read to you her words. Quote, "I felt listened to as a layperson, as a woman and an African in a church that most often has not given a voice, a church that has not had a chance to enrich itself with voice and wisdom from women, from lay people, and from Africans. I come to the Synod with the hopes, the joys, the dreams, the anxieties, the lamentations, but also the resilience of African women, lay people from the continent, and in fact the entire church that might not always get to sit at the center of discourse." When I asked her to elaborate on this, we began to discuss the African tradition of palaver, the ancient custom used in families, tribes, or communities to work through disagreements. While depending on where you're at, this takes on different forms, the idea is that when there is a dispute, the members of a family or a tribe gather under the palaver tree. The elders are invited so that they can share their ancient wisdom, and the young people are also invited to have equal participation to share new perspectives and ideas. What's always understood is that however grave or serious the disagreements may be, there are deeper ties that must remain. Everyone gathered is part of one family, and those bonds cannot be severed. And through collective discernment, a greater wisdom emerges. Reflecting on this tradition in light of the last month in Rome, Nora's words were simple and profound. She said, quote, "My village has long practiced synodality. Now my church is finally doing so too." Now, I've shared these stories and these postcards from the Synod, but if you're like me as a journalist who, when you get the final document, you look for concrete outcomes, you want to know what it delivered. And the answer is that there are many outcomes and proposals, but they're not enough. There are more than 80 proposals in the Synod's final document that will set the stage for next October's meeting. Among them, overhauling the church's seminary formation system, the recognition of, quote, "the urgent need to expand women's ministries in concrete ways," mandating lay involvement in decision-making in dioceses around the globe, performance reviews for priests and bishops, greater calls for collaboration and unity between other Christian churches, and much more. The fact that these are just proposals rather than outcomes will, for some, be dispiriting, and it seems as if it's kicking the can down the road. In fact, I do worry that there might be a certain amount of synod fatigue that kicks in for those that have already invested in this process for several years, and they're asked to now wait another year. But the Synod is something best understood from an experience rather than any document or indeed lecture, as anyone who participated in them or followed the plenary council here knows firsthand. Earlier this year, in a message to the Diocese of Parramatta, Bishop Vincent Long asked, quote, "What are the questions stirring in your soul these days? Can we make space to live in them, not needing to have answers?" That is indeed the question for the global church at this moment, as it undergoes this synodal journey together. As Pope Francis said in 2015, marking the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Synod of Bishops, quote, "The world in which we live, in which we are called to love and serve, even with its contradictions, demands that the Church strengthen cooperation in all areas of her mission. It is precisely this path of synodality which God expects of the Church of the third millennium." During the final days of the synod, this photo behind me attracted a lot of attention. It's of 19-year-old Wyatt Olivas from Wyoming, what we call in my country flyover country. He was the youngest member of the synod, and during one of the final coffee breaks, he approached Pope Francis with a request. He wanted the Pope to sign his permission slip to excuse him from missing classes for a month. You can see in the photo the Pope obliged. After he received the signed permission slip from the Pope, Wyatt gave the Pope something in return. It was a small white business card with 2 words printed on it, quote, "You matter." He later explained that it was a tradition that he'd started in high school to remind people they're not forgotten, that they matter. These are his words. "I think sometimes you forget the Pope is human too. So I wanted to give him a note simply saying, well, you matter too." Reflecting on the synod, Wyatt said despite being the youngest person in the room, he was taken seriously by all the bishops and cardinals that he'd rubbed shoulders with over the past month, and indeed the Pope himself. Quote, "I think that's important in our whole church, to take the young people seriously. We're here and we want responsibility." At the final Mass of the Synod in St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Francis said that this is a time for the church to dream. Quote, "A church that is a servant of all, the servant of the least of our brothers and sisters, a church that never demands an attestation of good behavior, but welcomes, serves, loves, and forgives, a church that opens doors wide as a haven of mercy." It's a call for authentic disciples. It's a call for people like Dom Helder Camara and other Christian witnesses in the 3rd millennium. For the likes of Wyatt and so many others, I think that's a dream of a faith that says to the church, and in fact the entire world, that, quote, "You matter." And I believe that is a dream of faith of a church that will attract many generations for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I've been sitting here thinking about 2 things. One, how wonderful it is that we began the year with Natalie's explanation of synodality and had that broken open to us so wonderfully. And now we've finished the year with stories that remind us, a group of people who perhaps are experiencing a little bit of burnout around synodality and plenary councils and things, how powerfully stories invite us into our own reflections and our own deep prayer life and our own questions. And I want to thank you for that. So Frank, no mean feat, but I thought I might use Vincent Long's question to you. What are the questions that are stirring in your soul at the moment?
Thanks, Kate, and good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Chris, for your presentation. Always great to catch up with you in Rome and to be able to read you and people like Chris Lamb, where you can write independently and give us on the other side of the world the benefit of your views. And yes, Kate, it's good for me to be asking questions, I think, because initially I was just going to give a response, but I thought that might be further evidence of the tyranny of the articulate. So I do have 4 questions, so I might ask them one at a time and you respond one at a time. We know there are hot button issues, let's say LGBT, women's priestly ordination. If we think of a far more synodal church than ours in terms of tradition, take the Anglican Church, where these issues can be wrestled with in a synodal way, but nationally rather than universally, and where there might be divisions, but there will be developments. How do you think this can work through within the Roman Church, where the synodal structure is less legalistic and where any answers have to be universal so that they carry in the north and the south and they carry in the east and the west? Question 1.
A real softball question to start off with. I think one of the things that I would say is that there's a deep awareness, if you read the 41-page Synod document, that there has to be a rethinking and a real study done of church law, and that canon law in its current form does not aid synodality well. So I think that's acknowledged from the outset. Cardinal Mario Grech, who heads the Vatican Synod Office, is a canonist himself, and he had said to me in an interview earlier this year that that sort of work, that heavy lifting, needs to be done now before the Synod even begins to head toward its conclusion, because there's a lot that has to be done in that space. So I'd say that. The other thing I would say is, one of the things we saw as a tangible outcome of the Synod on the Amazon in 2019 was the ecclesial assembly that emerged of the Amazon, that has a permanent structure of primarily lay people with some priests and bishops that actually has juridical authority. And I think that is, in a sense, perhaps what the Pope, the Pope's preferred method of operating is, to allow these things to happen on a local level, and for them to ask for things such as permission to ordain women as deacons, to relax the celibacy requirement. I think that is sort of the space that he's trying to carve out. I'd say it's in its experimental stage right now, these very early nascent years. But at one of the Vatican press conferences before the Synod began over the summer, Archbishop Tim Costello said one of the major tasks of this Synod has to be to decide where local churches have greater authority and control. And I think that is one of the big tasks heading into next October. It's going to be very difficult. Roundtables themselves are important for getting everyone in the room and talking to each other, but we haven't seen how they work when it comes to taking decisions. So that's going to be a very difficult area. But I think the Amazon, in many respects, is going to continue to serve as a test laboratory on these questions. So.
Thanks, Chris. Second question. Just about everyone we've heard who was at the Synod has said what a good experience it was, how friendships were developed. It could be very fraternal and be an honest exchange of views. Also, they spoke about how the final document of 41 pages, there had to be a hell of a rush at the end to get it signed off on, and that there were over 1,000 amendments made to that document with people working in processes in back rooms or whatever. As your colleague Chris Lamb said, someone observed that the progressives might have won on process, but the conservatives won on content. Those of us who weren't there, all we have is the 41-page document, the synthesis report. How important do you think this document is, and how much do you think it's going to shape the tracks along which the process will run in the next year?
One of the things that immediately struck me on that final Saturday, October 28th, when the document became available and I was reading it in the afternoon before they voted on it, was how cautious some of the language is compared to the language that we found in the Enlarge the Space of Your Tent document that set the stage for the discussions at the continental level, and then later the Instrumentum Laboris that served as the working document for the Synod. I think one of the reasons so many Catholics received those documents so well was because they viewed it as very honest and a rather candid discussion of the church in the modern world. And what you get in the final document, I don't think it's fair to describe it as the lowest common denominator, but you do get the sense that they're trying to restrain various impulses. So that has to be acknowledged. The way that someone on the drafting committee described it to me is that, yes, it's a very timid document, but there's room in that document to open space for a lot of different frontiers. If you notice, there's room in that document for the possibility of women preaching. There's room in that document for movement on the question of women deacons with some stipulations, acknowledging that more study has to be done on this. But there are pockets. On the question of LGBTQ issues, it does not use the acronym, but it acknowledges that the traditional categories and language that the church has used around this issue has to be better guided by science. So there are openings. So I think what we're going to see in the next year is what Susan Pascoe, from native daughter of Melbourne, described as a contest for the final document. We're going to see a lot of jockeying in the lead up to next year's synod. Ultimately, though, I think this document will be what has been described as a martyr document. It will be used as a framework, but it will not dictate precisely how discussions will go next year, because I think the Synod office is going to have to perhaps be a bit more heavy-handed in shaping the discussions and proceedings during the course of the month so that it can be aimed at decision-taking. So.
And third, Chris, we Catholics, we're very used to the contrast between doctrinal on the one hand and pastoral on the other. And we're used to doctrinal sorts of documents, we're used to pastoral sorts of documents. This document, for example, says, if we use doctrine harshly and with a judgmental attitude, we betray the gospel. If we practice mercy on the cheap, we do not convey God's love. The unity of truth and love implies bearing the difficulties of others, even making them our own. How do you think the synod's going to come down in the end? Are we going to end up with a document which will be primarily doctrinal or primarily pastoral?
Because synods are consultative, I mean, the synod does not have any final say on any of these questions. That power rests solely with the Pope. Now, I think we'll find a document that is probably largely pastoral in tone, that will take some of these 80 proposals and they will vote to make them into recommendations to the Holy Father. I think that is the shift we'll see in the document for the next synod, is that shift. But it's a real, the thing I will say, this sort of focus on doctrine is what makes those that are skeptical of synodality very nervous. We've heard throughout the month of the synod questions from certain naysayers. This isn't really a synod of bishops because lay people are in the room. And those sort of that make that charge or that claim see themselves and their roles in the synod as to be there as defenders of doctrine. I do think, just from a pure numbers perspective, they are a minority. So.
And just finally, in terms of process between now and next year, take, for example, the question of women for the diaconate. There have been 2 papal commissions on that already. The reports of those commissions have not been publicly released. The document states that there should be further research done on the question of women's diaconate. It then says, if possible, the results of this research should be presented to the next session of the Assembly. The lawyer in me says, well, why wouldn't you release the 2 reports that are already on hand, release them immediately, and why wouldn't you ensure that the further research that's done is released well ahead of the synod so we can all talk about it and we can hear from a plurality of theological experts?
How do you know what sort of further research needs to be done if you don't know what research has already been done? I mean, that's the reality of this. These 2 commissions, it's very frustrating for those of us who cover the Vatican. They were papal commissions under the purview of the doctrinal office, and they have not been made public. Now, I'm optimistic that their findings will be made public within the next year. One, the Synod document calls for it, but now the doctrinal office is headed by Cardinal Fernandez. And what we've seen in his very brief tenure, he took over in September, is almost overnight a preference for transparency at every level. So when we have a head of the doctrinal office who talks about his meetings on Facebook. So the precedent that has been set so far is a preference for that from his office. I think the question has to be put directly to the Pope. Will he release those documents, and do so now? And it could be a question that journalists put to him in a few weeks on his next trip. The Pope does not have to face the press in any sort of regular scheduled forum, except on the return flights from papal trips. And at the end of this month, the beginning of December, he's off for a 2-night trip to Dubai for COP28 for the climate summit. And if certain journalists have their way, that might be a question we ask him. So.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Frank, for those questions. Now, please don't be intimidated by the tyranny of the eloquent. You know, they were very sloppy questions asked by Frank. I think we can all agree straight off the top of his head today. So we've got a few moments for questions from the floor, and I'm wondering if anybody would like to ask Chris a little bit more. Thank you. Do we have it? We have a microphone. Just a moment, just so that it's captured for the people at home. Oh, yep.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, how do you think young people are actually responding to synodality? Because I'm 22, I'm Catholic, and I look around at a lot of my other kind of younger Catholics, especially in Australia, tend to be more reactionary or quite critical of these things. And another thing as well is that a lot of these people are actually very entrenched in like working class values as well sometimes, so they're actually, they're good people, and they're also very prone to misinformation and all kinds of things on the internet, like Taylor Marshall and all those kind of, very, very nasty things. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, how are young people actually responding to synodality? Are they positive? Do they have valid concerns, and how are those voices being incorporated into the synod?
It's a terrific question. I think it's a complicated answer that I'll try to give. One, if I look back on my coverage of the synod from when it began in October 21, when the Pope officially kicked it off, and I've gone to a number of conferences in Europe, North America, Africa, on synodality in some shape or fashion. There are two groups that I would say are the most enthusiastic about it. There are those that saw the promise of the council and 60 years ago, and now they're seeing, or soon thereafter, and now they see this as a moment to really bring some of those aims and priorities into fruition. And there are young people. And I would say there are young people engaged that are very excited about the synod process, but also those that you described that are very online, perhaps very fearful, entrenched, and see that it as their job to be engaged, but in a way to protect the faith because they see this as a great threat to it. But nevertheless, they're engaged. It depends on where you go. I mean, I remember being in Kenya last summer and being shocked that they had over 5 million people participate in listening sessions, and over 80% were young people. That's a pretty impressive number. Those numbers wouldn't be anywhere similar in this country or my own home country. So I think it's not a top-down process, but in places where the leadership has made it a priority, people have responded better, I would say. And I certainly see that in the U.S., in the dioceses where the bishops have really invested in synodality and treated it with a certain level of seriousness. The response has been greater, and then vice versa. The only other thing I'd add to that Again, these are incomplete thoughts, but one of the interesting things in the synthesis document is this talk of the digital continent. So much of the synod took place in continental stages, and so what emerged was this idea of a digital continent as being where a lot of the church lives a lot of their life, especially young people, and that the synod hasn't really utilized that to its full potential. And I think there's a real push to explore that space in a greater way. So, yeah, it's a tough question that needs a lot of debate and discernment and coverage. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Thank you for another one up the front here. I'm just going to own up, and it kind of goes to that question too. I've been reading for the last month or so while Mark's advertising's been going out. Instead of "Will our faith have children?" I've been reading "Will our children have faith?" Which I think sort of speaks to where synodality might enhance that or take from it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent talk. My name's Hayden Walters. I'm a professor of epidemiology at the university. And therefore, I'm almost obsessed by representation and balance and sampling and randomness and all that sort of stuff. I have no idea who the people are that even are nominally representing me from Australia. I just wonder, I mean, you have some lovely photographs, and you sort of dealt with this inter alia in a way. Lots of people who seem to be very good are there. But how do we use the enormous science there is about how you get representative samples into this process? And how representative do you think they were, and of who? Or whom?
I'll try to give you a crash course in how the makeup of the room was decided. So historically in synods, each bishops' conference from around the globe gets to decide who their delegates are, and they vote on them. And you can get anywhere between 2 and 5, depending on the size of the country. So that typically makes up the core composition of the room, followed by delegates that the Pope handpicks. What was added to this year's synod was the category of what they called non-bishops. And so they took the 7 sort of regional bishops' bodies, for lack of a better term, and asked each of them to nominate 20 people who have already, 20 names, and then the Vatican selected 10 from each region. So that's how you got the 70 non-bishop members, roughly a fifth of the voting members. And were they representative? On one hand, perhaps not, because they had to be people that had already put their hand up early on in the process, because the Vatican specifically asked that those that were nominated as non-bishop members have a track record in being engaged in synodality. Now, among those, I do know from those that were involved in the selection process, there was an attempt to, towards parity there with, a certain number of religious sisters, a certain percentage of laymen and women, and that sort of thing. But there were obvious areas of oversight. There was only 1 or 2 diocesan priests, just parish priests in the synod. So that's an area that's already been pointed out as lacking. There were no young people from Asia or Africa. So there are obvious holes, and some of it comes down to privilege, some of it comes down to time, and some of it comes down to just the individual bishops' conferences who made these recommendations. So I would say it was far more representative than any other synod of bishops, but not nearly representative enough. So it's a very difficult question. In terms of geographic diversity, that is fairly evenly distributed in terms of the numbers. One of the things Cardinal Grech said at a certain point was that the laity, though, were far more attuned to the process from day one because they wanted to be there, whereas there were many bishops who had no experience in synodality and were there because they were sent there. So the way I put it was it's kind of like the difference between the draft versus voluntary enrollment. So.
Yeah, I've got another question here.
Hi, my name's Ron. Question I've got is, you've got a year between now and when the final paper or the next synod is. So you've got the synod office who's going to be preparing the document, but also I imagine there'll be Pope Francis and there's the Curia which will be editing or having input into it. How do you see that working? Who's going to be have the greater input into that document?
Well, the document that has to be produced is the text, the 41. That's already been produced. What has to be determined is the methodology of how the actual 3 weeks, 4 weeks to be determined will look. You know, what will be the themes, how will they take decisions, who will be speaking, perhaps what sort of papers will be presented beforehand during the discussion. And that will largely come from the Vatican Synod Secretariat. You know, they have a large degree of autonomy that, from everything I'm told, and I have good reason to believe them, is quite independent. Now, they go in and see the Pope with some regularity, typically once or twice a month. But I think at every step along the way, the changes to the Synod as it's evolved have come from that office, most notably the decision to stretch it out from one synod to 2 synods. That was kind of a homegrown idea within the Synod office that was then presented to the Pope, and he signed off on it. But I think we'll see sort of the theologians and those that have worked closely with the Synod office taking the lead here. So.
My name's Sue. I'm a Franciscan Missionary of Mary. Thank you, Christopher, for your presentation. I appreciated that very much. And this is not a question, this is a request. Sure. When you have that possibility to speak to Pope Francis on that papal plane about the findings of the commissions from the diaconate, can you please remind him that the International Theological Commission in 1974, we're celebrating 50 years next year, found out that, made a finding that there was no prohibition on the ordination of women. Now, 50 years, for those of us who've been in here for the long haul, to find out a synodality comes up with yet another thing, with another commission, with more study, we say, not only will the faith not have children, it won't have women. So, please.
Thank you. So I just want to say that is, I've talked to so many people, particularly through the UISG, who have, in a sense, been responsible for nudging this question forward for some time now. This is a frustration that is widely shared and felt with them. It was something that I acknowledged in my report on the final report, was this very fact that you just presented. So it is a source of widely shared frustration. So. And you know, there's the sort of idea that if you want an idea to die, you send it to commission. And so the thought that this could just be subject to further study is deeply, deeply troubling for a lot of people.
Chris Peter Sheehan, thank you very much for your presentation tonight. I just wanted to ask a brief question about consultation. This has been worldwide consultation, a very impressive process. And as you said, the documents that arose from that were really good. Is that done now? What are we talking about a post-consultation process? What, if anything, can be done through discussions here?
So
just give us an idea of it.
This was the source of some debate, because you have this 11-month pregnancy, as Father Timothy Radcliffe, the Dominican who led the spiritual retreats, described it. And so the Synod office didn't provide a checklist or a real map as to what the next year should look like, and they left it up to the local level. And some people are already on it. Nora, who I mentioned earlier, when I caught up with her the day after it all ended, you know, she represents Ghana, and they had, this was on a Monday, she was flying home that evening, getting in on a Tuesday, and that Wednesday, They had a meeting where every diocese in the country had been asked to send 2 representatives to the call, and they were going to then be asked to identify, each diocese was then going to be asked to identify 2 people from each parish to consult with and get their reactions to the synthesis report. So that's, I'd say quite engaged consultation. The bishops of the U.S. were meeting this week for their plenary, and they were supposed to decide a way forward. Bishop Flores, a very capable shepherd of this process from day one, and has done a very fine job in the U.S. of shepherding the Synod process along. He spoke for 20 minutes today, giving his update on the Synod experience, and then he asked if anyone had any questions, and no hands went up. So, I think we're going to see, as we've seen throughout this whole process, mixed results. So.
I'm John Nowak. You have mentioned roundtables, the role of the Spirit of Jesus, and other very useful concepts. Now, I am part of the Lutheran tradition, which also relies on synods. But there are always limits to discussions here at these synods, because some of the Lutheran churches insist that the Bible must be taken on its literal level as utterly inerrant and infallible, which puts an end to a lot of discussion. Now, I'm wondering how is the new movement in the Catholic Church managing to avoid such rigid dogmatism?
Well, I think the whole hope of the Synod process for so many is not to double down on the dogmatism, but to present and encourage individuals to live authentic lives of faith that is attractive, rather than just simply telling people what to do or to believe. That's the hope, right? There were just over a dozen, I think, fraternal ecumenical delegates that were present at the Synod from various Christian churches, including a Lutheran representative, as they are at every Synod. And so they were able to share their own traditions, experience of synodality. And one of the ecumenical delegates that I spoke with after the fact simply said, basically said it's their job to go around the world attending synods as fraternal delegates, and said that this experience was unique. And when asked why, they said, well, four words, 4 letters, P-O-P-E. So, what does that mean? And he said, well, there is the hope that, obviously consultation is great, but at the end of the day, decisions have to be taken, and there's at least a place for that and someone to do that here. So that was their perspective as an ecumenical delegate, but we'll see how, there is 1 or 2 pages on ecumenism. It's more focused on practical ways of shared collaboration and working together, but that's both the hope and the challenge is to learn from other Christian churches.
One last question.
Hi, thank you. My name's Catherine. I come from Berwick. My question is this. I see synodality not as a one-off event, but as a way of life. I often hear that people are fatigued with synodality, and we can't keep hosting huge synods. It's got to be at all levels of the church. So how do you see us overcoming this fatigue, and how do you see that we will implement it at every single level and really engage with our faith? Because that's what I think it calls us to do. It's probably not an easy thing to answer.
Yeah, I sometimes say that as a reporter, my job is to point out problems, not provide solutions. So I'm going to be unhelpful here. What I would just say is that this is the great challenge, both now and the year between and also going forward, is, how does it take whatever document that comes out or decisions are made and get implemented at a local level? I think dioceses that have sort of more synodally minded bishops have a head start there. Where there are things like, mandated pastoral councils, things like that kind of serve as a check. I think these are so we'll see church law, I think, change in some concrete ways that forces people to begin to change their operations in terms of how they organize a diocese, how they organize a parish. But it has to be something that is lived and shared. And so I think we're going to see it succeeding in some areas and failing disastrously in other areas, as so many things happen, as so many things do in the life of the church. There will be a steep learning curve. So I know that's not a magic bullet, it's not a solution, but that's just, I think, the messy reality is that it will be a mixed bag in terms of implementation. So. But the expectation from the top would be that is, to use the words of Francis, the way of being church in the third millennium. So.
I wonder if, given we did start a little bit late, we can sneak in those last two hands that went up. Is that okay with everyone? Yeah, so it was 1 and 2. Good.
Right there.
Yeah, and then over there.
Thanks, Chris. Excuse me, I'm Michael Herry, a Marist brother. It seems to me that the Catholic Church is on the horns of a dilemma. Many good folk want to expand the tent to make all welcome and even seek out folk on the margins. We've all heard the terms and we all endorse them and they're terrific. Yet Jesus also spoke about calling people to repentance. The church exists, the church, as I see it, exists to serve the gospel of Jesus. Jesus did mix widely and welcome people and associate with people on the margins, and we're all called to do that, but he also called people to repentance. And that's the dilemma. For example, I'll give you an example. On today's Cath News, there was an article about Catholics not being allowed to be Freemasons. And this was introduced by a bishop in the Philippines who wanted some feedback from Rome on what he should do about it. And they quoted in this article the 1983 declaration signed by Joseph Ratzinger at the time, admittedly 40 years ago, when he was prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, declares that Catholics who enrol in Masonic associations are in a state of grave sin and may not receive communion. That whole sort of language makes me uncomfortable, and yet that's what Pope Francis has signed. Hence the dilemma. Would you like to comment on some of that?
Well, first I want to say how much I've enjoyed spending time getting to know the Marist over the past 10 days since I've been in Australia. I've been hosted by Brother Mark, and so I've had the good fortune of spending a lot of time with Marist. And on this particular question, I would say I'm not a theologian. I don't want to practice theology without a license. I would just say, this is part of what you find in the discussion hall in the Synod and in the final document is this tension. It's very lived and it's felt. But I think the focus that Pope Francis has continued to emphasize is the order. First, the authentic witness where you live alongside people, and only then can you get to discussion of the doctrinal issues. And I think that's what he sees as the way in which the church should head. And I think that's sort of why we see sort of synodality emphasizing so much first on the experience before getting to the doctrinal questions. So.
I'm Jerry McKernan from Sense of the Faithful, and I think most of you know that we are continuing this discussion on the Synod next week, right here at Newman. I'm just wondering, Chris, do we have too many items on the agenda items, and would we be better off for decision making having fewer?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not on the Synod Secretariat, but 80 proposals is a lot to get through. And Synod delegates are already complaining that they didn't get much time to rest last month. The discussion should probably be tightened. And so they're going to have to figure out what of these 80 proposals they want to sort of focus on, because there's no way they can work through 80 proposals in a month's time. So, yeah.
So that's been a rich and full evening of thinking and wondering and pondering and enjoying just fabulous stories. Chris, on behalf of all of us gathered here tonight and the people playing along at home, thank you. You began by saying that you weren't, as a journalist, you try to hold yourself back and not to have your opinion. And I think from what we've heard this evening, firstly, your personal integrity in this shines through very deeply, and the fact that you can attend such a momentous occasion as the Synod on Synodality and come away from it with a step back and a real eye on the big picture, but also a personal perspective on how things are travelling and where the possibility and where the hope is, and can share that in a way that doesn't compromise the integrity of the process is a great gift. And I thank you for that. And I thank you for those tremendous stories that you tell. Our faith rests on the quality of the stories that we tell and the way that we tell them. And you tonight have shown us another way of being and another way of knowing, and or reminded us of that other way of being and other way of knowing, and that Synod isn't something we just watch from afar, but it is something we all deeply live and experience. And you've brought us into that with story in a way that I think will resonate with us all over quite some time. So thank you for that, and importantly left us with as many questions as answers, and there have been some answers in there, so thank you for that. It's been a privilege to have you with us. Thank you. I'd like to thank Guglielmo and Frank and the rest of the team here at Newman College for hosting us again this evening. They're always so gracious in inviting us into their space and allowing us to come in. And I feel like we are a lovely little community who keep turning up and gathering. And there is something important about just turning up, isn't there? And guess what? We've got some great things to turn up for next year, because Mark's already been busy getting people ready to come and be with us. So here's some advance notice of what we're in for next year. In February, we've got Monsignor Thomas Halick coming to be with us, who's been part of the synodality process as well, has been here a few times before. It might be a familiar name to you, and will be coming to speak about more or less, just the little topic of the search for God in a postmodern world or a post-Christian world. So we'll look forward to that in February. And then a little later in the year, somewhere around July, August, still to be locked in, but Dr. Miriam Wijlanus, Mark, I hope I've got close there, who is a Dutch lay woman. She's a canon law expert. She has a background in child safeguarding. She has a background at the Synod, really dipping into that question we've sort of talked about tonight about where doctrine and law meets pastoral significance, and will bring some of that experience to us. Mark, with no hyperbole whatsoever, said she is, as a canon lawyer, the most highly respected woman in the Catholic Church. So I think, again, we're in for another real treat in the second half of next year. And with that, can you join me in thanking Brother Mark? Has he slipped out again? Oh, he's a rotter, isn't he? Oh, he's sneaking around the back. Mark, for all of your wonderful efforts on behalf of the Catholic Church in Australia, for the beautiful words you gift to us through your writings, and the tremendous work you do inviting people to be with us and amongst us so that we can learn and grow as a church and as people of God together in synodality. Thank you. I'll give you a hug later. So thank you all again for being here. It's been another terrific evening. It's an opportunity to have a little chat and a catch up again, and we'll see you all in February for the next one. Thanks very much.